Picture this. You're a German soldier in 1917, and word spreads through your trench that Canadian troops have been spotted across no man's land. Immediately, your fellow soldiers start requesting transfers, not because they're facing a massive army, but because they'd rather fight an entire British division than face a single Canadian battalion. What could possibly make soldiers from the world's most polite country so terrifying that enemy forces would literally run away rather than fight them? Today, I'm going to tell you the shocking story of how Canadian forces became the most feared fighters of World War I, and why that reputation continues to this day. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll never look at Canada the same way again. Canada. Land of maple syrup, hockey, and people who apologize for everything. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. When Canadians went to war, they became something completely different. Something that made hardened German veterans wake up in cold sweats. When Canadian forces first arrived on the Western Front, nobody expected much. These were colonial troops from a peaceful nation known more for lumberjacks than warriors. The British command initially viewed them as supplementary forces, useful for holding defensive positions, while the real armies did the fighting. But the Canadians had other plans. While other Allied forces followed conventional military doctrine, these colonial soldiers decided to write their own rules of warfare. And those rules were about to change everything. What happened next was so effective, so terrifying, that German intelligence created special classifications just for Canadian troops. They weren't just another Allied unit. They were something entirely new. Something that would haunt the German army for the rest of the war. But before we dive into their most shocking tactics, let me ask you this. What would you do if you knew that surrender might not save your life? Keep watching, because that's exactly the reality German soldiers faced when fighting Canadians. It started with the night raids. While other Allied forces maintained defensive positions after dark, Canadian troops turned nighttime into their hunting ground. They would blacken their faces with coal, put on thick rubber gloves for silent movement, and carry specially crafted weapons designed for one purpose: silent elimination. But here's what made these raids truly terrifying. They didn't stop at the front lines. While British forces would capture a trench and call it a victory, Canadian troops would keep going. 1 kilometer, sometimes more. Deep into German territory, spreading chaos and fear wherever they went. Imagine you're a German soldier sleeping in what you think is a safe rear position, only to wake up to find Canadians in your trench. This wasn't supposed to happen. The front line was supposed to protect you. But the Canadians didn't care about your front line. German intelligence reports from 1916 documented something they'd never seen before. These Canadian forces operated with what they called cold efficiency. They were methodical, relentless, and absolutely refused to stop advancing once they started. One German officer wrote in his diary, "The Canadians attack at any hour, without warning, and they never seem to tire. Sleep has become impossible when they occupy the opposing trenches." But the psychological warfare was just beginning. What the Canadians did next would make German soldiers prefer facing overwhelming odds rather than fighting these polite colonials. The Canadians didn't just use standard military equipment. They created their own weapons of terror. Homemade clubs designed for silent killing. Modified knives that could eliminate sentries without a sound. Every piece of equipment was evaluated for one thing. Could it kill quietly? But the real weapon wasn't steel or wood. It was unpredictability. German forces never knew when the Canadians would strike. It could be 2 a.m., 4 a.m., or just before dawn. The attacks came at random intervals, making rest impossible and turning every night into a nightmare of anticipation. Here's where it gets really disturbing. The Canadians discovered that the fear of attack was almost as effective as the attack itself. German soldiers would spend entire nights awake, staring into the darkness, jumping at every sound. By morning, they were exhausted before any fighting even began. And then came the intelligence gathering. Every raid served multiple purposes. Yes, they eliminated enemy soldiers, but they also mapped German positions, identified weak points, and gathered crucial information. The Canadians turned terror into a science. But what happened when German soldiers tried to surrender? That's where this story takes its darkest turn, and it's something that would define the Canadian reputation for the rest of the war. Here's the part of Canadian military history they don't put in the textbooks. After suffering heavy casualties from German machine gun positions, Canadian forces developed a disturbing policy. They stopped taking prisoners. Military records document instances where German soldiers attempting to surrender were killed, despite offering no resistance. One lieutenant's account describes how his men, having lost half their company to enemy fire, discovered the responsible German gunners trying to surrender, but chose to execute them anyway. Now, before you judge too harshly, understand the context. These men had watched their friends die in horrific ways. They were fighting in conditions that would break most people. But the impact on German morale was devastating. Word spread quickly through German trenches. Surrender to the Canadians wasn't guaranteed safety. This psychological weapon proved as effective as any rifle or artillery piece. German soldiers now faced a terrible choice: fight to the death or risk execution while trying to surrender. German intelligence reports began documenting a disturbing pattern. Soldiers were requesting transfers rather than face Canadian units. Entire companies would ask to be moved to different sectors when they learned Canadians were in the opposing trenches. But the Canadians weren't done. They were about to prove their effectiveness on a scale that would shock the entire Allied command and establish their reputation forever. Vimy Ridge. This heavily fortified German position had already defeated the British and French armies. Over 100,000 Allied casualties had failed to capture this strategic height. The French had tried and failed. The British had tried and failed. Now it was Canada's turn. But the Canadians didn't just show up and attack. For months before the main assault, they conducted 55 separate reconnaissance raids. 55. Despite suffering 43% casualties from constant gas attacks, they kept going back, night after night. In one single raid, Canadian troops cleared 450 meters of German trenches in minutes. Not hours, minutes. Each operation gathered intelligence, eliminated defenders, and spread terror throughout the German lines. By the time April 9th arrived, the Canadians knew every German position, every machine gun nest, every weak point in the defenses. They had turned preparation into an art form. Then came the attack. For the first time in the war, all 4 Canadian divisions attacked together as a unified force. The coordination was flawless. The execution was devastating. In hours, Canadian forces captured more territory, more prisoners, and more artillery than entire British armies had secured in months of fighting at the Somme. They didn't just take Vimy Ridge, they obliterated the German defense. German commanders couldn't believe it. How had these colonial troops succeeded where seasoned European armies had failed? The answer lay in their unique approach to warfare, an approach that was about to spread fear throughout the entire German army. After Vimy Ridge, something unprecedented happened. German units began actively requesting transfers when they learned Canadian forces were being deployed to their sector. Think about that. Professional soldiers asking to be moved rather than face the enemy. Captured German diaries revealed the extent of this fear. One soldier wrote, "I would rather face an entire British division than a single Canadian battalion." Another entry stated, "When the Canadians arrive, sleep becomes impossible and death feels certain." The reputation became self-reinforcing. Each story grew in the telling until the mere mention of Canadian troops could cause panic. German military intelligence had to create new classifications for Canadian forces. They weren't just another Allied unit, they were something special. But here's the truly remarkable part. This reputation didn't end with World War I. When World War II began, the Canadians proved that their effectiveness wasn't a fluke. June 6, 1944, D-Day. While all Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, Canadian troops achieved the deepest inland penetration of any unit. They didn't just meet their objectives, they exceeded them by miles. Fast forward to Afghanistan, 2001-2014. Taliban fighters frequently withdrew from operational areas upon learning of Canadian deployments. The reputation had survived nearly a century and crossed into modern warfare. Canadian snipers established multiple world records for longest confirmed kills in combat history. Today, Canadian Special Forces consistently rank among the world's most capable units. Their operational success rates and mission completion statistics rank among the highest globally. The contrast between Canada's peaceful international image and military combat effectiveness continues to provide tactical advantages. Enemy forces consistently underestimate Canadian military capabilities based on cultural perceptions, a mistake that has proven costly for over a century. So what made Canadian soldiers so terrifying? It wasn't superior equipment or larger numbers. It was a combination of factors that created the perfect storm of military effectiveness. First, they rejected conventional military doctrine in favor of developing their own tactics. While other armies followed the rules, Canadians wrote new ones. Second, they understood that psychological warfare was as important as physical combat. Fear became their most effective weapon. Third, They never stopped at initial objectives. When other forces would consolidate their gains, Canadians kept pushing deeper into enemy territory. But perhaps most importantly, they could transform from peaceful civilians into ruthless warriors and back again. This dual nature, polite in peace, terrifying in war, created a tactical advantage that enemies never learned to counter. The legacy continues today. Canadian forces maintain their reputation for effectiveness while their nation maintains its image as peaceful and diplomatic. It's a combination that continues to surprise enemies and allies alike. The next time someone makes a joke about polite Canadians, remember this story. Remember that beneath that peaceful exterior lies a military tradition that has terrified enemies for over a century. From the trenches of World War I to the mountains of Afghanistan, Canadian forces have proven that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones you least expect. What do you think? Were the Canadian tactics justified by the brutal realities of war, or did they cross ethical lines? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this story as shocking as I did, smash that like button and subscribe for more untold military history. Next week, we're diving into another military secret that will blow your mind. The story of how a single sniper changed the course of an entire war. You won't want to miss it. Until then, remember, history is full of surprises, and the most dangerous warriors often come from the most unexpected places.